David Guimaraens, good afternoon.
Good
Thank you
afternoon.
so much for welcoming us here today at Quinta dos Baroes for this I Love Douro interview in partnership with Grape Discoveries. You are the technical director and head winemaker at the Fladgate Partnership, and you are responsible for producing port wine for what is often referred to as the premium end of the port business, notably for Taylors and for Crofts and Fonseca and Krone, if I pronounce that correctly.
That's right, yes.
And so some of the people watching this video may not be absolutely sure what a head winemaker does. Could you tell us a little bit about some of your activities during the year?
Well, good afternoon, James, and it's a pleasure being here. This year I'm in fact celebrating my 30th anniversary of having come back home to the port industry to join my father in the family business. Right. And although I've grown up amongst the vineyards, amongst the vines, amongst the port barrels all my life. And as technical director is all very fancy director, very fancy title for somebody who's in charge of all the technical aspects, but the essence of it is that I lead a magnificent viticultural team where we have 350 hectares of vineyards in this extraordinary region, the Douro Valley, which is a region of mountain viticulture in hot climate, with many challenges that face us. However, it is in port that we find the most balanced, most sustainable style of wine for our region. And then we have the other aspects which a port house today covers: the winemaking, the transforming of the grapes into a young port. And that in itself has been a fascinating period to live through, because my early days accompanying my father to the different traditional wineries around the valley who'd make port in this beautifully simple but effective method of winemaking, which is the traditional lagar. Then when I came back home in 1990, I was faced with an enormous challenge, which was, as a region, we were no longer able to use the traditional method of foot treading for all of the ports that we produce. And there I developed these alternative modern fermentation vessels which replicate the action of the foot treading, but most importantly, they replicate the quality.
Right.
And that has been an extraordinary period to live through.
Yes, yes.
Then in the port business, we also have this very, very important aspect, which is the aging of the port in these either wooden vats or the barrels.
Vats, yes.
And this is where the port trade is quite different to the table wine business, in that we age our stocks, or part of our stocks, for many years. And here you have the role of the blender. The blender is a role which is very specific to the port trade, and it is the person who takes care of the stocks as they age, who will understand, when he looks at a young port, the capacity that has to age. He's the person who will defend the style of the house. And the style of the house has many factors which come into it, but undoubtedly the human aspect of the person who guides these ports as they age has got a key role.
You mentioned your father just now and working with him. This whole process, I believe you're a member of the 6th generation of your family to be involved in making port wine. That's extraordinary. This process of transmitting the baton from generation to generation, has it been, as it were, an exponential enriching process, or has it been, on the contrary, sometimes something a little overwhelming, an overwhelming responsibility?
I've never found it overwhelming at all. I guess because it happened naturally. Although my father did put me to the test when at the age of 19 he gave me a one-way ticket to Australia. But he also gave me a handful of contacts in the wine industry out there. And it was in that trip that I actually came to the conclusion that it really was the wine industry that I wanted to follow.
Yes.
So, whereas probably prior to that, when I was young, you looked at it as, well, that's what your father does, surely that's what you got to do. After that trip, having, in fact, visited the new world of wine, it really confirmed that this is what I wanted to do.
Yes, yes. Working and studying in Australia, and I believe after that you worked in California. Mm-hmm. Did these very different winemaking environments, did they affect your subsequent winemaking, port winemaking?
Very much so, in that you've got to remember that the Douro Valley is a region which has got 3 centuries of history, of tradition. And our viticulture in our steep slopes of the Douro Valley, our traditional viticulture, was very much based on a large amount of available labor at low expense. And our winemaking, our foot treading, likewise, was also dependent on a large amount of labor and at a relatively low expense. And when the social changes that led up to our revolution in 1974 changed our whole work environment in Portugal, we as a trade had no choice but to reinvent our viticulture, reinvent our winemaking. And
yes, that's very interesting, yeah.
And so I look back, and my father wasn't trying to get rid of me at the age of 19 and send me out to the Antipodes of Australia, but he was, in fact, he was a man of extraordinary vision, and he understood that in Portugal we have a lot of empirical knowledge, a lot of traditional knowledge, but by going to the New World, you went to see the other extreme. So there is no doubt at all that I look back at my 30 years since I finally made my way back from Australia in 1990, and I have tried and worked to bring together the best of the old world and the best of the new world, and I think that's why port today has never been as exciting or as good as it is.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you work with vineyards planted by your father and sometimes by your grandfather.
Very much so.
And you create port wine, which then matures in a bottle or a vat, and this port wine may be drunk by your grandchildren. It's extraordinary to think of this kind of distended timeline, which, when you come to think of it, is very unusual in the creation of any product, isn't it? What do you feel about this?
There is no doubt that within the world of wine, port wine has this extraordinary ability to age and evolve with time more than any other wine. And from that perspective, everything that we do, every wine that we make, every port that we bottle, that is going to be judged for its capacity to age over time. But when you get it right, it's extraordinary. And undoubtedly any one of us in the port trade who have the benefit to be a next generation, we will benefit from the knowledge that has been built up beforehand and what's been left by us. And so, yes, you do have that responsibility, but then normally you're not starting from scratch either. There are other challenges in this industry as well, in that which involves time, which is when you plant a vineyard. And my experience has been that a vineyard also needs to grow up, just like us human beings, before we actually become interesting and more mature. And so that is another very important aspect to how time affects us in our trade.
Yeah. It's almost superfluous to say here, perhaps, that port is considered as one of the world's truly great wines. Vintage port, of course, is at the top of the quality pyramid. When you create a vintage port, what are you trying to achieve?
Maybe if I could just probably bring an interesting perspective into that point, because undoubtedly for me, as a winemaker, vintage port is to me the ultimate of all the ports that we make. But quite often people do say, well, which is better? Is it this very old tawny port, or is this a very old vintage port? And I normally say that it's very difficult to put into terms what is one better than the other, because you can have a personal taste preference for a tawny over a vintage, or vice versa. But what I can say is that when you're making a tawny port, and particularly the very old tawny ports, that is a testament to the patience, the longevity of the company or the individual to hold on to these ports for many years, sometimes over generations, and the skill in taking care of that port over time, and to create these extraordinary complex tawny ports. Whereas with a vintage port, you have one opportunity to get it right. So automatically, the year is the most important factor.
Yeah.
If you don't have a good viticultural year, you won't have the grapes or the quality to make a vintage port. But then, say you have excellent vineyards, a great year, then you've got to have the skill to bring out the quality of those grapes to make a really, really good base young port with bottles of vintage. Then you have the blend itself of the vintage port, and what blend you actually bottle. And all of those skill sets, so the skill of the viticulture, the skill of the winemaking to get the quality out of those grapes, and the skill of the blend that you put together, will then be bottled in a bottle 2 years after the harvest to then age for a lifetime in the bottle. So you have one chance to get it right.
Yeah.
And if you get it right, your children or your grandchildren, every time they open a bottle, they will be saying, what an extraordinary job my ancestor made.
Yeah.
If you get it wrong, they'll be not opening those bottles. Not in front of their best friends anyhow.
Do you ever get any sleep?
I sleep well, fortunately, yes.
Yeah. In recent decades, a number of other fortified wines have dropped off the perch a little bit. Port, on the other hand, has bounced back. How do you consider the future of port production?
I'd say it's not bounced back. I'd say premium port has continued to grow and become a larger percentage of the overall category of port. Port has this advantage in that the distribution to over 100 countries around the world means that it's extremely well recognized. And yes, you will have fluctuations. One country will be at a peak enjoying port, whereas another one might be probably less that moment. But when we look across all of the world markets, the interest in vintage port, the discovery of tawny ports, aged tawny ports, has been something which has been a huge success story, to the enjoyment of ports like late bottle vintage, premium rubies. So I'd say premium port has never been as healthy as it is today. But there's one factor that's very important there, which is vintage port, and the role that vintage port has to play in keeping port to be considered one of the great fine wines of the world. And that is exactly this, what vintage port is as an extraordinary wine that will only be bottled when it is extraordinary. And then this capacity to age and the pleasure it is to drink a great vintage port. And I think that is why, compared with other fabulous fortified wines, you take sherry, you take Madeira, you take Marsala, they're all delicious, but you don't have that vintage port, that thing which is declared when it's extraordinary.
So the vintage port is in a sense the haute couture, which draws the rest of the
category.
The category, the pyramid. Yeah.
Very much so.
Yes.
Very much so, because if you think about it, the great wine enthusiast of this world, the great wine collector, the person who will seek to have a dinner party and choose a collection of wines which are absolutely fantastic, he will know that the best way to finish a fine bill will be with a great vintage port, and it will be sought for that factor. Discovering the year, how well is a 55 aged? What about those 63s, or how are these younger generations doing with the 92s or the 94s?
Yes.
And that excitement you get in vintage port.
If he was to hesitate in front of his choice, what would you recommend him? Which vintage?
I'd recommend one of my father's. I think the 63 Fonseca for me has always been my reference vintage port, and if any of the ports I make are as good as the Fonseca 63, then I'm happy with my career. Although I've now been around for long enough that you can start well evaluating the ports that I've made from the early times of my career, but I won't talk about those.
All right. Yeah. With your colleague Antonio Magalhães, you've developed I believe it's a sustainable vineyard development model. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
This very much links into the work that we've been doing together for, again, this partnership with this magnificent viticulturist, Antonio Magalhães. We've been working for 28 years together. And right in the early days of working together, we converted part of our vineyards at Fonseca's Quinta, main Quinta Pinascal, into organic viticulture. In fact, it was the first organic vineyards in the Douro Valley.
Was it?
And straight away, we learnt so much from that. And I would say that all of our viticulture that we practice today is a direct result of the lessons learnt from those organic vineyards. And our objective when we did that was not to convert all of our vineyards to organic, but I have no doubt that the lessons that we learnt from those organic vineyards led us to then develop what we believe is important, is to apply a sustainable viticulture across all of the region. And for that, in our region of the Douro Valley, where planting a vineyard on these steep slopes is a challenge, our biggest challenge is exactly, it's not one of disease, because the Douro Valley is dry. It's we have a low disease pressure naturally. It's one of erosion, herbicide use, and the sustainable aspect of our from an environmental perspective. So we did develop a model for planting our terraces. We introduced a laser-guided bulldozer, which sounds real Star Trek, but it's very simple. But in effect, what it's saying is that you need to take your water when it builds up and control it. And in fact, that was a world innovation in the world of viticulture.
Was it?
And that, together with managing our terraces so that we learn to live well with the winter weeds and just control them naturally in the spring and the summer, that led us to receiving a prize exactly for our vineyard model that we developed in early 2000.
Right. And do you find that this model is being followed by some of the neighbours?
It is. It is. There's no doubt that the method of building has now become recognised as the most
building the
terraces. Yes. In terms of the control of your herbicides, that has been not taken up by everyone. The challenge of the Douro in our viticulture is to reduce our overall pesticide use, and herbicides is one of the main challenges. So by developing this new vineyard model, we've been able to control mechanically the weeds by cutting them. Then our dry climate will control the rest of the growth naturally. And but that practice has been adopted probably mainly by producers who are also making their own wines. The challenge is getting that practice to be adopted by all of the farmers in general. And we have a lot of work still to be done there.
Yes, that's a challenge, yes.
It's a challenge that we have an economical sustainability issue in the Douro. And sadly, we have not been very intelligent in how we have adapted our whole rules that we have in our region. And it is very sad because we have an extraordinary region. We have two extraordinary styles of wine. We have port wine. We have the new generation of Douro wines. But our inability to change the rules in the same way that the region has changed has led to a lot of poverty and hardship in the Douro farmer, the farmer who lives from just selling his grapes. And I think that's a tragedy, and it's something that should shame all of us in the trade.
It is a tragedy. I believe there are an enormous number of smallholders. Would you like to make one or two suggestions about ways forward? I mean,
the Douro is made up of small grape farmers, medium-sized grape farmers, and large grape farmers. And there is room for all of them. They all have a role to play. And our challenge has got to be to make sure that we have the right vineyard area for the demands of the wines that we can sell. And then our biggest challenge has got to be to make sure that we have the same rules applying for both denominations of origins, which is something we don't have, tragically.
Yes. And that is government responsibility, or is it the IDVP?
It's all of us. It's all of us.
Yes.
Us as shippers, it's the farmers themselves, it is the institutions.
Sure.
So we all have a responsibility in getting our act together.
Yes, yes. In your opinion, how relevant an issue is climate change in the Douro?
My biggest concern with climate change is freak weather. Freak weather has been our biggest problem, be it hailstorms, be it unseasonal weather. So getting too much of a warm spell in the winter, anticipating your bud burst, or a thunderstorm of rain mid-season, which will create flooding and damage to the hillside. That is my biggest concern with climate change. I'm not concerned about temperature. We, in the Douro Valley, the Douro Valley can teach the rest of the world of how to adapt to a changing climate. Because in mountain viticulture, we have differences in altitude, where as you go up the hill, your temperature drops. You have differences in orientation. A north-facing slope is 2 degrees cooler than a south-facing slope. And we have differences within the region as we follow the Douro Valley, where it is less arid in the beginning of the Douro, closer to Régua. As we go east towards Spain, it becomes more arid. And we can, within one region, within 1 year, have so many different climate situations that we have the capacity to adapt within our own region to a changing temperature pattern.
Yes, that's
where we don't have the same capacity to adapt is hailstorms.
To the freak
weather.
Extreme incidents, yes.
That is my biggest concern with climate change.
Yeah. As the climate changes and at the same time consumer behavior evolves, how do you see, what kind of innovations can we look forward to in port production, and particularly the ports that you make?
Well, I think we've got one example which has been, we created Croft Pink, a rosé port, which is a style of port which very refreshing, informal. It allows us to take grapes probably from some areas which didn't have the same potential, quality potential to make a fuller bodied port, but we've been able to make this excellent style of port. White ports, white port and dry white port in particular. In fact, that's probably one of the most exciting categories in port at the moment. And that is a style which adapts very well to our region. When you're making a white wine, your natural acidity is very important to have your balance of your wine. When you're making a white port, you want your grapes to ripen more naturally, because that will give you the richness, and then the spirit used to fortify balances what you don't get with your acidity. So dry white port is an excellent category to cope with a regional hot climate. But in fact, port in itself, as a fortified wine, is the greatest example of sustainability in a changing climate world, in that when the year is perfect, you bottle a vintage port because the ports from the year turn out perfect. When the year is imperfect, you can take your imperfect ports and age them in wood over many years to become a perfect tawny port. But we've been doing that for centuries anyhow. So I think port is the best example of a style of wine that can adapt very well to a changing climate.
Sustainability hasn't just been invented.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. And in fact, we normally say that in the Douro Valley, where some years your problem is ripening to too high a sugar level, that in port is not a problem, because in the process of fortifying the balance of spirit, that for us is not a problem.
Right. Yeah. David Guimaraens, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights.
Let me offer you a glass
Fascinating
of
profession.
late bottle vintage port. We are celebrating our 50th year since modern day late bottle vintage.
Thank you very much.
Was first bottled. And it is a style of port which for me is extraordinarily important and excellent, because it's what I call a premium commercial port, because late bottle vintage is probably our largest selling line. We need a lot of very, very good quality grapes. So we have a very professional relationship with many grape farmers who supply us quality grapes to produce the late bottle vintage, which is a port which ages for 5 years in these large wooden vats. It's all got all the qualities and fruitiness of a young vintage port, but with a bit of smoothness that you achieve with 5 years of aging in wood.
Yes.
Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah.
Delicious.
Absolutely delicious, yes.